for the gown, Laura draped my bodice pattern based on instructions from the Workwoman's Guide for a full high bodice. I ended up lowering the neckline a little bit just for fashion reasons. I didn't go all the way to this black snail 221 height, but I did lower it a little bit, which you do see in the arrow. I bought past patterns number 806. It is the Lowell mill dress sewing pattern. I'll admit I bought it partly because it had a mill in the name, and I thought it had some kind of connection to a grist mill or a sawmill. Turns out they mean cotton mills. And there was a specific cotton mill kind of complex that was specifically recruiting workers from surrounding farms that were young women. And there kind of was this little miniature 1820s blue stocking-ish compound that happened as part of this planned community of workers for this one mill. It's just really fascinating. And so I didn't end up using that pattern, but I do want to credit it because it helped me see some of the construction transitions between late 18th century and early 19th century. So I consider it a really good resource that I still thought of as being something I used to inform the gown construction. Then for most of my construction, I had two main resources. I used Black Snail 221. I didn't use the pattern pieces, but I used a lot of her construction methods and a lot of her order of work. I also drafted my sleeve informed by her sleeve shape. So it's got a full lining on the inside that's bias cut, and then on top of it you have this big kind of banded down to the elbow, and then a big bishop sleeve. So I ended up flat patterning that, but it helped me to see what her proportions looked like from this extant, which interestingly is actually an English extant. So even though Black Snail Patterns is working out of Germany, and they have it specifically framed as a Biedermeier dress, it's actually from England, and it's held at the V&A in England. So given that we were focusing on the English American tradition of dress, it actually still is an appropriate resource. Then also Patterns of Fashion 1, the content, cut, construction, and context of English women's dress, 1720 to 1860. I took a lot of details for my planning, everything from the closure to the way the pleating was done on the skirt, from gown 44, which is a morning dress, morning, morning dress from 1840-ish. And I used a lot of details from that gown in my gown. I also added some, speaking of men's jackets, some bust chest padding to improve the lay of the bodice on my figure. When I have my stays on, there's quite a hollow in right below my shoulder leading to the bust. And it made the bodice kind of buckle because there just wasn't enough me underneath it. And we have ways of dealing with that in like modern couture, but I wanted to see what people were doing then. And it looks like most people just put in padding there. Interestingly, when you're looking at vintage or antique garments, you can see that padding. I think that means that they're trying to like enhance the bust. That's almost never the case. It's almost always apparently they're trying to fill in this hollow because your stays or your corset are already doing that for you as far as lifting the bust. So I actually used the chest padding instructions that Elizabeth Stewart Clark published in her 2010 article about chest padding. And I was really, really pleased with how that worked out. So I highly recommend that specific thing if you're trying to figure out how to make your bodice fit. I also added a faced and bound hem and a dust ruffle. I didn't get that from any specific resource. It's just something that I like to do on long 19th century skirts. I took a class on 19th century hems with Catherine Scholar a few years ago. And as a short person who has to go up and down stairs a lot, even if my skirt is a pretty respectable length for me, it just ends up dragging on stuff as I go, especially going up and down stairs or getting in and out of cars. So I like to have a dust ruffle on the inside of any skirt that's really going to potentially drag on my dusty floors and my cat fur all over the house. So those are also elements I added to the skirt. I actually had some people on Instagram kind of ask me like, what's your evidence for using that for this era? And I was like, if it's wrong, I can take it out, but I can't find any reason why you wouldn't do that. Especially when, again, I'm 5'2". I have to do things sometimes because it's what makes sense for me. Like, I didn't add like a big deep tarlatan facing or anything, but just there is a deep facing and a bound hem and a dust ruffle. And it just, in my experience, it makes the skirt more, both stand out a little bit better and it looks a little more like photos, and or not photos, but looks a little bit more like how people were depicting gowns at the time. But also, honestly, it makes it last better as a piece. So that's a very quick rundown of all of the garments it took to get this look that we have some images from that we're going to intercut with this audio. I also took notes. I got in the habit of doing this now. I'm going to make a new gown. I have the notes on the pattern packet itself, where I have, you can't read it. All right. No, okay, so I'll just tell you. Okay, so basically, I'll read it. I write what it is. I write what year I made it. What's hilarious is when I first started it, when I cut off the gown, I was still not used to being 2023. So there's a two that I had to turn into a 3. Yeah. So I write down what undergarments I used for it. It says 1840s stays, flat shoes, corded petticoat, chemise, and ruffled hip pad. Because without all those things, this thing will not work. I wrote down that it takes about 60 hours to cut and construct. And you need 8 yards of main fabric if 55 inches wide, and the same of lining and underlining. And the hem is 152 inches at the bottom. So I also did this thing I like to do with gowns where I, wrote my instructions to myself that I checked off as I worked through it. And then that's also, that printout is here in with the paper pattern. So that's one of my ways I keep myself organized, though, because it's very easy at this point. My costume closet is pretty full of all kinds of undergarments and skirt supports, etc. And it's very, very frustrating to get to an event and realize you have the wrong hip pads on, or something is wrong, and now your carefully made garment doesn't work. I also, where all this stuff is stored together, and I have a note literally taped down to the box where these things live, to the chest where these things live, that says, don't forget your shoes, your earbobs, your bonnet. I got my list of the stuff that isn't stored with these things because of just space and cleanliness. And I'm like, don't forget you need these other things to have to make this work. So that's what it took to make the 1838 first outfit. And the nice thing is, since I have all this stuff now, it means that for the next garment, next garment, I only need to plan to spend about 50 to 60 hours, actually constructing the dress. I have all the other stuff. Now I'll probably go back and make maybe a nicer version of some of the petticoats, or just different versions or warmer versions. Was deliberately, I planned it as a kind of summer garments, so everything's linen and cotton. If I find myself doing a lot of outdoor winter events, I might do a quilted petticoat. I might do a wool flannel under petticoat, things like that. But honestly, I don't feel the cold the way I used to. So we'll see. I might just throw a cloak or a cape over myself if it ends up being a cold event. Given also, honestly, I live in Washington, D.C. area, and it's hot versus cold more time in the year. So you have to worry that it might be, 95 degrees with 85% humidity for at least 3 to 4 months of the year, not the whole time, but like it might be that hot.
Right.
Versus if I lived in Minnesota, like I don't feel like that happens to you for like 120 days a year.
No, it's not a significant part of the year, although it was a much more significant part of this year than normal.
Yeah, I will say, like, just from the tear dress, and the tear dress, I don't wear as much stuff because I deliberately made it as kind of your housework dress versus this morning dress, kind of the dress you might wear to go visit your friends or go to tea. The tear dress is just a much heavier cotton. So the morning dress is made out of very, very fine cotton sateen, and then fully lined though in a quilting weight cotton. And so that's a whole other layer after all those petticoats, all that other stuff, which is part of why my base layers are linen, because in my experience, they just don't get as clammy as a cotton shift and under petticoat. But I wore my new tear dress out to an outdoor event last week. I was walking around for about 3 or 4 hours out in the heat with less petticoats. But it wasn't, I was warm, but I don't feel like I was warmer than I had been the previous day in a single layer, knit modern wrap dress. So, natural fabrics do breathe. And generally where I was warmest was honestly where I just had the most layers, which is about my waist height. So like all those waistbands and the stays, which are sateen cotton, does tend to add up as far as heat factor. So I don't currently have immediate plans to make another pair of 1840 stays, but when I do, I will almost certainly make them out of linen, just for breathability, and have those be my summer ones. Because the sateen one is very great. It's a wonderful piece. I love it. The artistry that went into it, I really appreciate Red Threaded and how they make that kind of garment something you can have and not have to make from scratch. But it does get a little hot. But it certainly pushes my shoulders where they're supposed to be instead of my like modern, goblin posture. So I get my shoulders nice and far back and get a lovely, relatively narrow back line. So that's a very quick overview. We will include, when we talk about this in the video, the actual reference resources. It's really important to me also, given all the research that we had to do and all the kind of vetting, honestly, we had to do on resources, that I want to share that with people and have it not be, I've managed to do what I believe is a good job at making sure that I'm not, enriching racists, but, yeah, I'll be really sad if I find out some of these people are, terrible people. But as far as I can tell, these are good resources. They're also good and solid from a perspective of the quality of their work and the quality of their research. And honestly, their relative privilege of access to extants versus just, looking, while it's a wonderful skill to look at a painting or a sketch and make a similar garment, there is a certain element of authenticity that's hard to get if you're not actually able to open up and look inside and see how something is constructed. And some of these resources are kind of a shortcut to doing that when many of us don't live places where we can do that. It's not typical to go, oh, I'm going to casually call up the, textile curator at the V&A and get to spend 3 hours with this extant 1838 morning dress. That's just not something most of us have access to. Similarly, the patterns of fashion books, that's part of why they're such a great resource. They are such phenomenally detailed descriptions and diagrams of these garments that just aren't typically available to people. So I think that's really important, is kind of bridging that gap between kind of doing a little bit of my own practice of kind of reading the original description of how to do something and trying it myself, but being able to also kind of bootstrap, if you will, my way up to the equivalent of looking as close as you can of looking at originals without actually looking at originals. Because it's just not something most people can do. And I wanted to not limit myself to that, but that was important to me, was to sort of say, like, how authentic can these get as reproductions without without first of all having a specific extant to work with, because of course we don't have anything from that era. People were unable to preserve their material culture for very obvious reasons, especially for the Cherokees after 1838. So we don't have a lot of original garments, period. But on top of that, you know, kind of having to conjecture or make assumptions just based on what's available, but also honestly making things that are available to you. So, you know, I have the good fortune to live in the United States where I have great resources as far as, you know, really beautiful, authentic materials from places like Burnley and Trowbridge. And honestly, the willingness and the interest to pay the shipping to get stuff from places like Sartor in Czechoslovakia, who made the print of the main gown. But the lining is fully it's a second print from Burnley and Trowbridge of a late 18th century gown. So that kind of made it especially authentic, was to be able to have the gown lined in what you could have had an older gown made out of, which people did. And that also makes it sit properly. So Sartor, their sateen fabric was just a dream to work with. So I definitely recommend, if you want something and you want a nice light, like a 19th century sateen, I can hardly say that the Sartor, what they produce, really is this lovely tight but thin weave, which is the hard part. And I feel like it's very easy to find quilting weight cottons, which are a little bit heavy compared to the originals. I think one of the weirdest thing, when we did get to go look at extants that were earlier than this period, was just honestly how very, very light and thin the fabrics are compared to modern fabrics, because of how they were produced. But that's a separate conversation. So yeah, so that's everything I wanted to cover in this session. What else did you want to say before we move on?
I think this is great. I think this covers that time period really well.
Thank you.